I watched my daughter-in-law toss a suitcase into the water. The sentence still sounds impossible in my head, like something you read in a newspaper and never imagine living. But there I was, on my sagging porch in October, clutching a chipped teacup, watching the whole thing unfold as if I'd been put inside a snow globe and someone was shaking me. It had been a quiet afternoon. The house always feels louder in the afternoons since Louis died. Little noises balloon into company, the tick of the mantel clock, the creak of the kitchen floor, the sigh of the old willow against the window. I had the kettle on, my tea cooling faster than I wanted it to. I was used to the empty chair across from me. I kept a folded photograph of Louis in my lap sometimes, just to feel the warmth of him there. He'd gone 2 years before, and the world had rearranged itself around that absence. Cynthia had moved in later that winter. She was always a storm, more storm than shelter, but she was his wife, and I tried, God knows I tried, to make her my daughter too. That afternoon, a dust swirl of an erratic engine caught my attention. I heard tires on gravel, sudden and wrong, like urgency made of metal and rubber. She pulled into the driveway and stopped with the engine still snarling. I saw Cynthia's head in the driver's seat, her hands white on the wheel. Her face was set in that flat, animal way people have when they are blocking out the world. Behind her in the trunk, a big old leather suitcase sat like a relic from someone else's life. I remember thinking that suitcase had seen too much. I remember thinking it shouldn't be in our lives. She didn't come to the door. She yanked the suitcase out of the trunk with both hands and started toward the lake behind the house. The path was wet with fallen leaves. The sun was soft and low, and the air had that thin October ape to it. I called out because that's what you do by habit. You call for a son or an old friend even when you know they won't answer. Cynthia didn't turn. She moved fast. The way she carried the suitcase was urgent, like it could burn her if she hesitated. I watched from the porch as she reached the bank, and then, without slowing, she swung the suitcase and threw it over the line of reeds like she was throwing away a curse. The sound it made when it hit the water, that hollow, final noise, still lives in me. For a second, it was just a splash, a dark smear on the lake. Then it began to sink. Everything after that happened in a handful of breaths and a long, slow stretch of time that followed. I dropped the teacup. It hit the step and flung porcelain fragments like a small white rain. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the railing to stop from falling. I ran. I do not run anymore. At 70, running feels like doing damage to an already tired machine. But there was no thought in the movement. I simply went forward until the world tightened down to the sound of water and my breath.
The lake's edge smelled like old leaves and cold things. The leather came back up to me before I did. It bobbed among the reeds, half submerged, its corners pillowed by mud. Cynthia was gone. I stood there for the smallest, fiercest minute thinking, where did she go? Did she? Then I heard something. It was faint. A sound like a hiccup, an animal noise maybe, a thread of life from the suitcase. I don't remember thinking to take my shoes off. I remember the water at my knees, then my thighs, then the chill climbing up like fingers. People talk about cold as a simple absence. I can tell you it is something that pushes at the edges of you and tries to push out your edges too. The leather cuffed me hard when I grabbed it. The zipper was stuck with mud. I fumbled with nails that suddenly felt clumsy and young. Then the zipper gave. The blanket inside was blue. I remember the blue. It seemed wrong to see baby blue at the bottom of a lake. There was a smell of river rot and baby powder. And then there was the baby, small as a fist, slick with water, the hair glued to its head in little dark ropes. Its mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to remember how to breathe. Its lips were a color I had seen once before, that bruised purple-gray that means air isn't getting where it should. I put my hand under its shoulders without thinking and lifted. Its weight was nothing and everything. I wrapped my arms around that tiny shape like it was the only thing left to hold and ran back to the house with water soaking into my clothes and cold crawling into my bones. I was doing things without thinking about them because thinking would have been a luxury. I stripped the baby of the silted blanket and pressed him to my chest. He made a sound, a fragile, wet wail that could have gone either way. I remember half smiling without meaning to because sound is sound, and sometimes it arrives just to spite you with hope. Call 911, I shouted to no one because the phone was on the hall table, as if the house had known I would need it. I managed numbers in a breath between choked sobs and the practical movements of an animal saving a newborn. I talked to the operator, but my words floated as if I were underwater. Baby, I kept saying. Newborn, water, lake. They told me what to do. Warm him, keep him breathing, stay where I was. A man's voice on the line saying calm things is a comfort that has nothing to do with the sound. It is the way the world organizes itself again so you can act. I wrapped towels around him and tried to imitate the way I'd watched young mothers pat cheeks in grocery stores years ago. The baby's skin felt paper thin and frightened. I clamped his nose shut with a finger and breathed in and out on him the way nurses had once breathed on my grandchildren in pictures. Nothing felt like enough. I put him on my chest to share warmth and kept murmuring until the sound of my own voice steadied me. I don't know if babies understand words, but somewhere between the panic and the breath, the breathing came a little steadier. The paramedics arrived with an urgency that made the back of my neck feel cold again. They worked with that efficient quiet that people in uniform seem to have, like a practiced ritual. One of them, young, freckled, moving with the surety of someone unafraid, lifted the baby, then looked at me and nodded as if to say, "You did right." They wrapped him in a foil blanket that made him glitter like a small comet. I tasted copper on my tongue. My hands trembled so much they kept slipping on his tiny limbs. At the hospital, the NICU smelled like antiseptic and tired hope. Machines hummed like a chorus of waiting angels. Eloise was there. She'd been on duty that day, or so she told me later. But in that moment, she was a presence that pulled everything into a frame. She was the kind of nurse whose hands made you believe in stitches and people. She looked at the baby and called him little one, as if the diminutive could carry him through. They wrapped him deeper, put a tiny cap on his head, and whirled him into a room where lights were sharp and everything felt like it was in slow motion. Hypothermia, they told me. Newborns cannot regulate temperature the way adults can. Water kills heat. Heat is life. They worked and measured and told me to step outside while they stabilized him. I stepped out, because you move when people tell you to, and because you can't be in both the place of waiting and the place of watching simultaneously. I found myself sitting on a plastic chair, the kind that imitates furniture and fails, next to a vending machine that hummed like a nervous clock. Father Anthony found me there. He'd always been more comfortable in the nave than a hospital corridor. He took my hand like it was an old habit and began to recite a prayer under his breath. I did not think of God as an actor in the scene. I thought of words as small life rafts. He put a hand on my shoulder and said things that were both religious and human. "We are with you." "Is he—" My voice broke. The question was both practical and stupid. Of course he was. He was a thing of flesh and breath and terrible odds. The nurse came out and said he'd had a struggle to breathe, but they'd warmed him and his color had improved. The emergency team had put him on oxygen and were watching his heart rate. It was all words that translated to, "For now, he is with us." When I finally saw him for real, they let me hold him for a moment through a small opening in the NICU curtain, a pinch of closeness. He was so small his hand could barely wrap around my finger. I said his name out loud then, "Because you name the things you have claimed." "Hector," I said, without knowing if the name would stick. It felt right, like socks pulled onto cold feet. But the world did not straighten itself because he had a name.
The hospital corridors soon filled with other sounds, the clack of shoes, the low murmur of a radio, the practical questions that fold you into a bureaucratic fold. The police came. They moved with a different priority than the paramedics. Where the medics had been saving breath, the detectives were saving facts. They asked me for my account, and I told them in that bare, straightforward way you tell the truth when there's no art and nothing to hide. I told them what I had seen and what I had done. I told them about the leather suitcase and the water and the sound that had kept me moving. They took notes. One of them, Detective Salazar, looked at me like someone trying to place a face on a map. She was younger than I had expected for someone with a badge and a case of this gravity, but there was a steady intelligence behind her. She kept asking me to repeat details, to be precise. I could feel other eyes on me in the antiseptic hallway. I felt naked in a way that had nothing to do with my clothes. A man with hair like pepper and a pair of tired eyes leaned in close and said, "We need to take your statement." The words were gentle but final. They took my statement and retook it. They asked about Cynthia, where she had gone, what she had said, what they'd been arguing about the week before. I told them that Cynthia had been distant lately. I told them that Louis had died 2 years ago, and that sometimes grief makes people strange, that she had been more volatile since then. I admitted, without trying to make a story, that I had had my doubts about some things that had happened around Louis's death. I did not know if they were true. I only knew what it felt like. Questions are a net. They capture moments. They push you to tremble. The detectives kept asking, and I kept answering until my voice felt thin. They asked me the obvious but necessary thing. Did I see the baby? Yes. Did I see anyone else? No. Where did she go after she threw the suitcase? I did not know. Did I know of any enemies? No. After an hour that felt like a day,
An officer came back in with something that made the air thin around me. He had a printed photograph in his hand, one of those reconstituted stills from a CCTV camera. He put it on the table like evidence and pointed. The picture showed our driveway and the lane toward the lake. In it, a car was there. In it, a figure was there. But the figure did not look like my Cynthia hurling a suitcase. The angle made everything flat. The timestamp on the corner was blurred, like the world itself had been slightly out of focus when the camera recorded. "I want you to look at this," the officer said. "Is this what you remember?" It was what I remembered in a way and not in a way. The image showed movement but did not show the heft of a thrown object, the arc of leather in the air, the sound of the splash. It was a frozen second.
My recollection was a film strip of things: sound, scent, the heft of the suitcase hitting water, and the glove of cold that came up when I hit it. The photograph reduced it to pixels and angles. For the first time since I had run across the grass, I felt the world tilt under me. Detective Salazar watched my face as if reading a verse. "We have to be thorough," she said. She used the kind of measured voice that does not accuse, but sets the terms. It sounded like a procedural thing, because that is what it was. But when I looked into her eyes, I could see the possibility of doubt there, the professional skepticism that applies to everyone, even people who are also victims. "You're sure you saw her throw it?" she asked. "Yes," I said. The word came out small and certain, like a vow. I saw it. I saw her swing it and throw. "But the camera," the officer began. "Cameras lie," I wanted to say, blunt and almost cruel in the way grief can make you. I held myself back. Instead, I said, "Photos don't give the whole story." Police procedures began weaving themselves around me. They took my fingerprints, an indignity, if you like, that felt like being pressed into evidence one more time. They asked for my phone and my keys, and wanted to know every little step. I cooperated because the world wants cooperation, the way doctors want cooperation, the way salvation demands it. Each piece they took felt like someone was cataloging my rights away, not because they thought I had done anything, but because bureaucracy has a habit of flattening the human into files. I found myself waiting in a room with the vending machine again, the same humming machine that now felt like it was mocking me. My hands were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. Father Anthony kept returning, a small, steady presence like a lighthouse. Eloise, the nurse, came by to give me small updates. The baby's temperature had improved. His breathing had steadied, but he was still in a fragile place. She held my gaze and said, "You did the right thing, Betty." Those words were an anchor. At the same time, another part of me was fragile, because the police had that photograph, and because the world likes tidy explanations. And sometimes tidy explanations require someone to fit inside a box marked suspect. Someone brought me Cynthia's name again like a cut apple. "Where is she?" they asked. The last I had seen, she had vanished down the path like a piece of weather. I hadn't followed. I had not chased her. I had rescued what needed saving. Those were facts. But investigators needed to know twists and turns of motive. They needed chain of custody and alibis, and anything that made motives clear. I had none of that in those first hours. Only a body to warm under my hands, and the raw knowledge that someone had tried to put a child into the bottom of a lake. I thought of Louis. His name kept threading through my sentences like a forgotten hymn. 2 years earlier, the police had come to my doorstep with a different kind of photograph. They had told me that his brakes had failed and that the driver he was with didn't see the other car until it was too late. They had wrapped that event in a word we used without thinking: accident. But grief is a suspicious animal. It has a way of noticing small misalignments later when people have a little distance. I had spent long nights reliving small conversations, going over bills, the way Cynthia's voice had softened suddenly when it spoke about money, the way she could look like a woman counting out futures. I did not voice accusations then, not to them, not to the detectives who were doing their work. I merely sat with my coffee and the watchful, slow patience of a person who had to trust that the world would assemble itself into truth. That night, the hospital hallway took on a dream-like quality. The NICU was a little island of light and beeping. I would steal looks through the glass,
watching Hector's chest rise and fall, the oxygen mask sitting like a small silver crown. Nurses and doctors moved with the certainty of people who had become bilingual in crisis, equal parts compassion and procedure. I hovered, present and absent, a grandmother stitched onto the edge of a life. At one point, Detective Salazar found me in the corridor and asked if I had ever seen Cynthia act desperate. The word pressed in a bruise. She was always good with appearances, I said, remembering parties and glossy smiles. She kept things tidy. She made arrangements. My voice was quieter than I intended. But desperation is different. It sharpens people in ways you don't forecast. Salazar listened without judgment. We're looking into financial records, she said carefully. Property, trust changes, anything that could suggest a motive. We have to consider every possibility. I left the hospital that night with a hospital sweater over my shoulders and Hector's name like a small flame under my ribcage. The snow globe had shattered, and the shards were sharp. I slept badly, if at all. When I closed my eyes, I saw the leather suitcase splitting the lake's smooth surface, water clinging to stitches, the blue blanket like a small forgotten flag. In the morning, the world would start reassembling itself into questions and subpoenas, into tests that would demand DNA and timelines. In the morning, detectives would talk about cameras and a photograph that did not contain the whole of an action. But in those first hours, what kept me going was the tiny breath that had been coaxed back into a newborn chest. What kept me moving was the knowledge that I had been the one to open the zipper and find him there. The act was a small and huge claim. I had opened something, and it had opened me back. If you like true-life survival stories, subscribe for more. The next day began with more people and paperwork. The hospital insisted on tests and a protocol. Pediatricians are meticulous, and for good reason. The baby was wrapped in leads and sensors, and a tag that made him feel official, like an item in a catalog of the living. They took blood samples for routine checks, and the nurses asked me to sign forms that used the word custody like a clinical object. I signed, because what else do you do when the world asks for signatures that mean you may keep breathing on behalf of another person? Detective Salazar returned with a small folder at her side. Her expression was one I had seen before on teachers and on judges, the kind of look that could both console and unsettle. "We need to be sure of this," she said in that matter-of-fact way. "We're running the tapes from nearby home security cameras and from the highway cams." She slid a printout across the table. It was the same photograph, but zoomed. The image gave nothing of the sound. It gave nothing of the weight. It showed the compact car pulled at the edge of the path and a figure moving away from the bank. The timestamp flickered at the corner of the frame like an electronic heartbeat. In the photograph, there was a shadow where the suitcase had been, and then there was nothing. The technician's note taped to the back suggested a window of time that made me a suspect in their timelines. In some crowd minds, a body can be both rescuer and conspirator until proven otherwise. "I don't understand," I said. "I saw her throw it. I watched her do it." "Memories can be very vivid," Salazar said gently. "They can also be mistaken." "Mistaken?" The word left me like cold smoke. "I am not mistaken about throwing a leather suitcase into a lake." She did not argue. Instead, she asked me more questions about Cynthia's last known movements, about Louis, about whether anyone else had reason to harm the baby. She asked if I had enemies. I thought about the little list of petty disputes that had built up over the years, property arguments, a neighbor's feud about pruning the hedges, and the answer was no. None of them would do what had her done. None of them had the will. There were other complications that afternoon. A social worker came by the hospital to take an initial history. Her name was Alan. He had a soft voice and a brief professional smile that tried to make the world seem easier than it sometimes is. He asked about my living situation, about whether there was someone to care for me if I were going to take on a child. He asked if I had any health concerns, and he backed up bills, whether I smoked. The questions were steady and sometimes humiliating because they treated me like a package to be inspected. I answered them and tried not to sound defensive. Behind Alan's courteous questions, bureaucracy began to spread its clinical hands. There would be background checks. There would be home inspections. There would be parenting classes, they said, and paperwork that made taking on a child look like acquiring a car. I told Alan I had brought up children before. I had loved and lost and loved again, but he had forms to fill and boxes to check and did not want my history of loss in place of a social worker's checklist. I felt both ridiculous and fierce. Could a house full of memories of a son be a home for another? I kept telling myself it could and would.
I packed a small bag with soft shirts and a blanket from Lewis's wardrobe, like a ritual, an offering and a promise that, if the world allowed, we would make a life in the outline he had left. Meanwhile, the detectives were quietly turning over other stones. They asked about a mechanic who had been seen around town recently, someone who had worked on cars in the area. They also mentioned transfers, bank transfers that had been made out of my son's account after his death and into accounts I had never heard of. I felt my stomach drop like an elevator. Money and motive had a way of intruding into grief like a parasite. I had watched small calculations slip into Cynthia's eyes at times, a gauging that had made me uneasy, but to think she would escalate, there is a certain moral gravity to imagining the worst in someone who had once been close to your child. They asked me to be patient. They said they felt it was best that I not go anywhere. I felt like a prisoner, not in a locked room, but in a time that kept asking me to be put under glass. I promised them cooperation. I meant the promise, even while I had a small, furious part of me that wanted to go looking for Cynthia and shake her until she told me everything. That night, the lawyers would become a whisper at the edge of everything. Not yet. It was still the first day, and storms make a long list of things to do. The detectives were polite but thorough. They collected my phone records. They asked me to identify photographs. They asked me to be patient while they verified alibis. All of it felt like an interrogation of the smallest claims of my life. I returned to the NICU early the next morning and found that Hector had gained a little color. His lips were less bruised, the way someone's hand relaxes from a fist. Eloise smiled when she saw me, and for the first time since the water, I felt less like a shore and more like a harbor. I was allowed to hold him with a clear protocol. Wash hands, sign, stay in the chair. I sat and he slept on my chest like a small cat. A nurse let me whisper nonsense into his ear, silly little comments about the weather and the foolishness of modern appliances. In those tiny conversations, I felt like an ordinary grandmother. The world balanced then on those small comforts. A warm hand, a safe nap. It was not peace, it was not forever. It was enough for the moment. And then, like a thunderclap you don't hear until later, the broader machine shifted. The press had caught wind.
Someone had leaked a fragment to a reporter. Someone always does. Our local news station wanted a quote. Phones began to ring with people who had opinions and pity in equal measure. There were calls from distant relatives whose voices were more curious than condolent. The simplest of actions, saving a life at the edge of my property, had become tangled in other people's agendas. I wanted to be ordinary again. Detective Salazar, to her credit, continued to move with the steady attention of someone who knows the difference between gossip and evidence. She did not, in those first days, make a spectacle. She collected statements and she wrote them down. She told me not to talk to anyone about the case in order to protect both the baby and the investigation. I obeyed. How do you argue with instructions that might keep a child safe? But the photograph kept gnawing at me. I knew what I had seen. I knew the weight of the leather, the way the water had taken it. I could not unsee the curve of the suitcase's arc in my mind. Yet the camera, flashes of angles and timestamps, snipped my memory into a stillness that felt foreign. I had to reconcile being the woman who saved the baby with a photograph that, in some people's eyes, might not support that story. Late in the day, a plain folder arrived from the detective unit. Inside were copies of bank statements and a mechanic's invoice flagged with suspicious annotations. I read them like one reads a recipe, careful, precise, until the shapes familiarized themselves. There were transfers my son's account had made after his death. There were muted entries and odd placeholders. The mechanic's invoice had been paid in cash, but there were receipts for brake work that Lewis had never spoken about. Details like this bloom in a mind like mold when water is present, small dark things that feed on the damp of grief and suspicion. I found myself in the odd position of being both a protector and the subject of scrutiny. It is a strange thing to be lauded as a rescuer and then have the world lean toward you with questions like a doctor listening for a murmur. People want a clean line for these messy stories. They want villains and heroes drawn in bold. Life rarely abides. The hospital decided to keep Hector overnight for observation. The term observation is both humane and bureaucratic. They monitor the temperature, the reflexes, the way his lungs work under stress. They watch for infection. They feed him in measured amounts and wait to see if the world will take him back. At home, the police placed a discreet notice that services were tracking CCTV footage across the area. Someone had been thorough enough to check cameras at the small marina, the convenience store up the road, and the traffic light at the intersection near the highway. The net had been cast wide for reasons I could imagine. Cameras are impartial, or so we tell ourselves when we need objective truth.
My reality, having seen a person throw a suitcase into a lake, would now be compared to lenses that could lie by omission. I went home that night with a sweater smelling of antiseptic and the kind of tired that sits in the jaw. I lay awake and tried to sort the images. I thought of Louis's face when the brakes failed years ago, and how the wrench of that moment had been hidden inside other people's explanations. I thought of Cynthia's hands on the leather, the tilt of them as she let it go. I felt a vague, physical ache in my chest that had nothing to do with age. It was the hollow that loss leaves, deep and echoing, where new possibilities can sometimes take root. In the small hours, I wrote a letter to Hector. It might seem foolish. I folded a page and wrote about the house, about the willow tree, about the way Louis used to whistle when he cut the lawn. I wrote about my hands and their habit of making bread, and how sometimes life gives you something you didn't know you were asking for. I left it on the table near the mantel clock, because ritual steadies us when the world spins. The week ahead promised tests and legal talk. There would be DNA to prove parentage, and there would be an inquiry into Louis's death. I felt time splitting into two tracks, what I needed to do for the baby and what the world needed to prove for its own reasons. I could feel that the photograph would become a line in a report, that people who didn't know me or my son or my sorrow would see a grainy image and draw conclusions. I could also feel the resolve forming like a muscle under the skin. I had opened the suitcase. I had pulled a small life from the dark. That fact, no matter what a camera said, resided in me. But doubts breed other doubts, and the next day the camera footage the police retrieved would be more than ambiguous. They would bring a still that might make me appear less a rescuer and more a confused witness. I could not let that stand unchallenged. The world was going to demand an explanation, and explanations take shape in courtrooms and in the cold print of bank statements. For now, Hector slept in his incubator, and I sat beside him like a sentinel, my hand on his tiny foot, feeling the steady, improbable pressure of life. Outside, the willow leaned like an old woman listening to the rain. My house was full of echoes and the faint smell of baby powder. I kept thinking over and over about the sound of the suitcase hitting the water, the way it became a punctuation mark in a sentence I was still trying to read. Detective Salazar left me with one instruction I could obey easily: do not speak about the case to anyone. She said it in a tone that mixed procedure with concern. I nodded. Obeying seemed small and big all at once. It was a way to keep Hector safe and to keep myself out of the center of a swirl that could tear everything I had built into fragments. The world continued to turn in practical ways. People signed in at the Children's Center, and the hospital computers kept chugging. Social workers penciled questions and stapled them into files. The tiny, sharp bureaucracy of survival clicked along. Meanwhile, I went about the private work of an old woman suddenly engaged in a youthful fight. I started making plans in the small scale of the house, clearing out a spare room, buying a small crib, sewing loose buttons back onto shirts. I wanted Hector to come home someday to a place that smelled like bread and had a bed for naps. I wanted ordinary things to act as bridges over the extraordinary horror that had brought him into my life. And while I made preparations, the detectives were making theirs. They promised me they were following every lead. They promised they would be thorough. There was a calmness in Salazar's professionalism that made me feel less alone. But there was also a paper that mattered more than any promise, the photograph that had been taken from the corner of a camera that did not see the motion I had seen with my own two eyes. Some mornings, you wake to the quiet of a world that has not yet judged you. Other mornings, you wake to tapes and prints and people whose job it is to find the slightest tilt toward crime. My life, for the first time in a long while, had the feel of a courtroom play, where characters entered and exits were carefully controlled. I felt both defiant and small. I had opened a suitcase and found a child. That was the center of things. But the world wants the center to be neat, and my truth was messy, saturated with water and breath and the remnants of grief. That day, as the sun came up and painted the willow a dull gold, Detective Salazar called me in for a meeting. The photograph would be shown again, she said, and there would be a conversation about inconsistencies, about alibis, about CCTV angles, about what could and could not be seen from a grainy camera 100 feet away. I put on the sweater Louis had loved, and I went with her, because not going felt like a betrayal of the small blue life that had slotted into my chest. We walked into the station, and I felt 100 eyes on me, like weather. They showed me the frame, one small freeze of time that did not contain the motion I knew to the marrow of my bones. I looked back, not to convince them, but to remind myself that memory sometimes keeps its own counsel. I had opened that leather zipper.
I had lifted a body that might have otherwise gone under. That fact would not be altered by the weight of a photograph. When the meeting ended, Salazar's face had softened in a way that suggested both sympathy and the burden of an investigator who had to stay impartial. "We will get to the bottom of this," she said. "We'll need to verify bank records and speak with the mechanic identified on one of the invoices. We'll want to find Cynthia." I nodded. I wanted to say more, but the words felt like sending small boats into a storm.
I left the station with a head full of the kind of toiletries that keep you human: a toothbrush, a sweater, a photograph of someone you loved who could no longer speak. That night, I sat up and wrote a list. Not a list of vengeance, as people sometimes assume when they hear injustice stories. A list of practical things I could do to make my case stronger for Hector. Document the house, gather pictures of Louis and me and the way we had lived, call the bank about accounts I could show as legitimate, line up references from neighbors and the minister who could act as a character witness. The list was a way to make strategy out of storm. And yet, even with plans and lists and a photograph that insisted on being its own truth, there was that small, unassailable memory that resumed when I closed my eyes. The flash of leather, the splash, the zipper giving, the blue blanket, the tiny chest finding breath. If the cameras could be wrong, then perhaps the truth had its own defenders. For now, that tiny defender slept in the NICU with a hat pulled over his ears and a monitor's soft beeping like a lullaby. The next chapter of this nightmare would involve a lot of small, patient work, paperwork that felt like prying open a wound to look for infection, and a few sudden, sharp strikes that would change everything. Detective Salazar and her team moved quietly but with purpose. They showed me a spreadsheet one afternoon, the kind with columns and numbers that look boring until you realize they map a life. The entries were transfers, small at first, then larger, flowing out of accounts that had once been Lewis's. Some went to names I didn't recognize. Others stopped at accounts with names I later learned were shell corporations. The words offshore transfer were typed in a box and sat there like a verdict in waiting. "You see patterns," Salazar said. She used the same steady voice she used when she'd asked if I'd seen Cynthia that day by the lake. "We need to follow them." They followed the money to a local mechanic shop where a man named Carlos Medina worked on everything from rusted pickups to lawnmowers. Carlos had been known in town as someone who could make a car do what you wanted if you paid him enough. He was the kind of man who stuck to the edges of the town's affairs. You saw his hands in a roadside garage and his name in a receipt taped to a file. When they brought him in for questioning, his hands were ink-stained and his voice was small. It didn't take long before Carlos started telling them things he might later regret. He said he'd been paid cash to work on Lewis's car months before the accident. He'd done work on the braking system. He said he'd adjusted something and left it in a way that would fail under a certain pressure, that he'd been told not to mention it.
He said he'd been paid again after Lewis's death, and that a woman, Cynthia, had handed him envelopes and told him to keep quiet. Hearing him say those names felt like watching a theater reveal its backdrop. Suddenly, the painted sky was a little more convincingly a world. The detectives collected receipts and statements. They had phone logs that showed calls between Carlos and a number linked to Cynthia. They had bank records with withdrawals that lined up to cash payments. The pattern began to look like a plan rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. Altered brakes, transfers after Lewis's death, and then an attempt to get rid of a newborn who could tie everything to them. At the same time, the DNA results came back. I will never forget the day Dr. Alan Mendiz walked into the small room at the hospital where they let me sit with the air like a held breath. He carried a folder, and he didn't sit down at first. He folded himself into a standing posture like he was balancing seriousness and mercy. He explained the tests in terms I could understand: markers, matches, probabilities. He had the sort of bedside manner you get from someone who's used to telling people that their lives have suddenly rearranged themselves. "It's conclusive," he said finally. "The newborn's DNA matches your son's. He is his biological child." The room moved. I felt the floor tip in a way that was almost vertiginous. To be honest, there was a moment of ugly calculation, fear that this knowledge might make things more complicated, that it would entangle Hector and other people's motives. And then another, truer wave. Relief that the child I had pulled from the lake was mine to fight for by blood as well as by love. It was a heavy, double-edged solace. They asked me then if there were any other relatives. I listed names like a ledger. They asked me about Lewis's will, about life insurance, about beneficiaries. We unearthed a document that Cynthia had apparently worked to change after Lewis's death. She had moved money. She had made decisions as if the future had already agreed with her.
Everything they turned up was another stitch toward the same seam. The mechanic's receipts, the money flowing away, the suspicious changes to accounts and policies. It was a picture of motive, money and the elimination of obstacles. But motive and action are different things. The detectives needed both, and I needed both if I wanted to wrap Hector in the law's protection. The social services part of the story became its own battlefield. Alan came like an inspector of hearts, but his tools were forms and boxes. He spoke kindly and asked the kinds of questions that make you feel both scrutinized and cared for. He ran background checks and called neighbors and made notes about how my home would fare as the environment for a child. Inspectors came and measured windowsills, checked smoke detectors, looked in cupboards for cleaning supplies stored dangerously low.
I thought of the spare room I'd begun to clear out and the little crib I'd bought with a trembling sense of hope. It felt absurd to have to prove I was fit to raise a child in the middle of what was essentially a criminal investigation. I took parenting classes no one my age imagined taking, infant CPR, feeding schedules, car seat installation. I paid for things I could not afford with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had learned the arithmetic of love, that safety meant money spent now to avoid a debt of sorrow later. I sewed, I shopped, I spoke to doctors and took their advice. Every box Alan checked felt like a small victory. I wanted Hector to have everything he needed to be ordinary: clean pajamas, a soft blanket, muffins on the counter some mornings, and I wanted the legal system to recognize that my home could offer that. At night, while Hector slept in the NICU and little machines kept watch over him, I wrote more letters. I wrote to the judge, to the social worker, to Lewis as if he might read my handwriting. I collected photographs that established a life, photos of Lewis teaching me how to plant tomatoes, of the willow tree in summer, of holidays where voices were full and dinner was a chorus. I gathered neighbors' statements of support and a letter from Father Anthony about my stability and character. These papers were small offerings, lit candles at the altar of bureaucracy. And yet, while I gathered proof of my capacity to care, the detectives sharpened their case. Carlos's testimony was corroborated by physical evidence pulled from Lewis's old car, an inspection that found irregularities in the braking system consistent with tampering. Salazar and her team also tracked the money trail further until it made the kind of curve that prosecutors like, a web linking cash payments to a mechanic, to transfers, to the changing of beneficiaries. It gave motive a backbone. When the prosecution prepared to move, they did so carefully. They could not risk letting Cynthia slip away into the noise of pity or clever legal defenses. They needed a confession, or at least an incontrovertible set of circumstances that would stand under the pressure of a courtroom. I remember Salazar coming to me one morning with a plan that made the blood go a little cold, a sting. It was the exact kind of thing you see on television and then forget is messy, real, and dangerous. "Hector's safety comes first," she said. "We need to get her to talk. We'll set a bait meeting. You don't have to meet her alone. There will be a team. You'll wear a wire." I heard her but felt the ground tilt at the word wire. I was an old woman. I had never wanted to be anything but harmless, but the small flame that was Hector in my chest refused to be a thing I risked anything but everything for. Some part of me, the part that had launched across mud and reeds to pull a newborn from the dark, recognized that this was what rescue sometimes required, an act of courage into a den. We rehearsed. Salazar's team walked me through the details. The meeting place was a warehouse down by the old industrial stretch of town, a gray building with corrugated metal that smelled like oil and dust. They told me where to stand, how far the nearest officers would be, how the microphones would be hidden. They told me the signal, a small vibration in my hand that would mean get out, and a panic button that would call the team to act. When the day came, I felt like a child at a strange party, wearing something I'd never imagined, a small recorder pinned to my sweater like a hostile prize. I had on sensible shoes. I had also stitched into my pocket a scrap of Lewis's shirt that smelled like him, as if talismans mattered. I drove to the warehouse with the seatbelt tight and my hands in my lap. Father Anthony sat in the car a few yards away, looking like someone waiting in a chapel, and I held his gaze like a prayer. Cynthia was late. That made the nerves worse. Late used to be a kind of throttle. When she finally arrived, she looked smaller than I remembered, and older in ways grief could make you. She moved like someone who measures everything now. I could see the edges of a life that had once been precise, now frayed. The talk began cautiously. She sat across from me at a table, fingers curled, eyes like someone who had practiced being unseeing. I kept my voice steady as I said small things, about the weather, about how Hector had a name.
She gave me bits of attention, an old reflex of domestic politeness, but what I wanted was rower. I wanted words that would put the madness into plain sight. When she finally spoke, it came as a confession, and a confession is an ugly, honest thing. Cynthia's voice melted and hardened at once. She spoke of money, of feeling trapped, of seeing opportunities where others saw necessity. She admitted to paying Carlos. She admitted to altering Lewis's car. She admitted with a terrible clarity that she had intended to remove obstacles that might tie her to future expenses. She even used words like insurance and security. It was as if she had been rehearsing the language of motive for so long that it had ossified into an explanation rather than a confession. Salazar's voice was flat and professional in the recording that exists now in a folder under the prosecution's arm, but in the room I heard only Cynthia's voice wavering and then snapping into cold lucidity. She told me she'd planned to get rid of the baby. She told me the drowning was part of that plan. She said it as if she were explaining the weather, factual, necessary, and lacking in the human punctuation that gives context to evil. She said the words that put a chain around the thing I had pulled from the water and made it into a crime. She had tried to make sure no one could connect the baby to Lewis. She had tried to erase evidence. For a moment, just a fraction of a moment, I felt something I did not want to name, a wicked longing for retribution.
It rose like bile, and I swallowed it down. After all, I had been told not to speak. I had come here to record, to listen, to cooperate. My role was not to administer justice. My role was to survive it. Then the world narrowed to a sound, a sudden metallic pop and pain. Cynthia's movement had changed. Her hand flashed to a pocket. A gunshot cracked the air. The sound was worse than any newsreel could make it. It was close and personal and smelled of hot metal and fear. The room erupted. Salazar's team moved with a fast choreography, but those few seconds are the ones that refuse to leave me. The way the table tilted a fraction, the way someone's shoe scuffed the concrete, the harsh bark of orders. I felt a searing strike along my side, and then a cavernous emptiness, where it felt like someone had taken sand from inside me. They tell me now that the bullet lodged in muscle and that I was lucky. They tell me I lost a lot of blood and that the hospital staff worked like angels. I remember only the confusion of cold and the way Father Anthony's hand found mine and the taste of iron. I remember a voice, Salazar's, telling Cynthia to drop the weapon. I remember the sound of doors slamming and men shouting and the sudden thud of boots. I remember waking up later and learning that the gunshot had missed what mattered most, Hector. I learned later that the officers had moved in, saw Cynthia fall to the ground sobbing, and heard her admit things into the recorder that would later unspool in court. I learned even later that Carlos's statements and the recordings matched. A plan, payments, the attempt to erase evidence. The arrest was messy and human. Cynthia screamed and cried. She cursed, and then she said my name, and then her voice broke and she was small and ordinary and terrified in a way that was almost obscene beside the gravity of her acts. I did not want her dead. I wanted accountability, something that would not let her hurt anyone else, and that would secure Hector's life. Seeing her in handcuffs, having the lawyers read her rights, watching her get wheeled away, felt like a theater drop. The show had a final act, and it was horrific and real. I woke in a hospital bed with a gauze on my side, and Father Anthony sitting beside me with a thermos of tea. "You're stubborn," he said when I smiled weakly. It was his way of loving. I was given antibiotics and pain medication, and the steady, unimaginative comfort of nurses who mended more than flesh that day. Eloise came to check wounds and to say quiet things about resilience and the miracle that Hector was safe. "You did good," she said, as if practical kindness had a shape. The courtroom process that followed moved like a slow machine. Cynthia was indicted on several counts: attempted murder, tampering with a vehicle, conspiracy. Charges that the prosecution argued with the patient cruelty of lawyers. The recorded confession from the warehouse sat in evidence like a black stone.
Carlos's cooperation helped the prosecution tell a chronological story, and the brake tampering evidence was presented with diagrams and photographs that reduced complex mechanisms to points a jury could follow. I sat through the trial with a kind of numb concentration. Each witness was a new slice of truth. Dr. Mendes explained the DNA in a way that made me feel the geometry of it. Carlos testified quietly, with shame or fear, and the detectives outlined a timeline that fit the events into a needle eye. The defense spun different stories, as they must, some of them clever and mendacious, looking for gaps and exploiting ambiguities. There were moments I felt the press on my face like weather, flashbulbs and whispers. There were moments I felt very old, like a witness in a world that had suddenly required me to be an actor. In the end, the jury's decision was what it was. Cynthia was found guilty. The verdict rattled through the courtroom and out into the town. It did not make Louis return or undo the lake, but it made accountability real in a way that felt like attaching a lifeline to a drowning person. Cynthia was sentenced. Details were carefully reported and taken away in the custody of the state. More importantly for Hector, the court granted me temporary custody pending further review. That was a tremendous relief, an official recognition that the child I had warmed against my chest at the lake was mine to raise now under the law's protection. Social services continued their evaluations. The prosecutors supported my case with the evidence I had helped assemble. They said plainly that a child of his age should be in a stable, loving environment, and that the fact I had found him and cared for him counted for a lot. Adoption is a strange word when you are an old woman. It is paperwork and joy in the same breath. I remember sitting in a small room with Judge Alvarez at the bench the day I finally signed the papers that made Hector legally mine. He was 20 months old then, more full of life and ache than I had imagined in those first months when his chest rose and fell under tubes. He had a mop of dark hair and a grin that turned a room into light. I signed documents with fingers that trembled and a voice that had the quiet steadiness of someone who had been given something that felt both improbable and thoroughly deserved. Father Anthony and Eloise and Salazar came to the adoption. Carlos had been sentenced to time and had agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. He came to court to face what he had done. There was shame in his posture, a real human contrition that did not erase harm but offered some fragile form of repair. Cynthia's face, when she watched from the defendant's bench, was the outline of a woman who had chosen a terrible path and was paying for it. Then the slow work of living began. Hector learned to walk, then run, then get into trouble.
He was a child who loved puzzles and who would sit and stack blocks with the fierce concentration of someone trying to make sense of a world he had found his way into late. He loved peanut butter on toast and a game where he hid under a blanket and then popped up shouting, "Boo!" He began to say my name in the way small children do, bright and testing, "Betty!" And later he called me Nana with a proud little lisp. And then one day, after the papers were signed and the ceremony had the soft holiness of a small legal blessing, he called me Mom in private once, and it felt like a confession that we both kept. Time does a good job of repairing some things. It does not erase the lake or the zipper in my hands or the sound of the suitcase finding the mud. Those are part of me now. But time also gave me evenings with Hector sprawled on my lap looking at picture books whose pages smelled like crayons. It gave me a life of ordinary errands, the grocery store where he insisted on smelling the oranges, the park where he chased pigeons, the way he scraped his knee and I kissed it until he giggled and told me I was silly. He filled the small rooms with a noise that healed in increments. There were quieter reparations as well. The community rallied in ways that sometimes surprised me. Neighbors dropped casseroles, strangers left notes. Father Anthony organized a fundraiser when I ran thin on money for unexpected legal fees. It wasn't always fair. Sometimes help arrived too late or in ways that felt like an apology for someone else's absence. But the principle of human reciprocity looked good on the porch where Hector learned to clap. There were hard days. The papers, the testimony, the hearings. There were anniversaries of the accident and days when a smell or a sound would send me back to that October afternoon. I grieved for Louis often and openly. I talked about him to Hector as he grew old enough to learn about the father he would never meet. I told stories of the things Louis liked, how he used to whistle while he gardened, the way he sliced apples for pie, so that absence would have texture and not become a void. As Hector grew, we found small rituals that gave me comfort and gave him roots. On Sundays, we walked to church, where Father Anthony insisted on holding him during the sermon so he could wobble in his arms and giggle when people made faces at him. On winter mornings, we baked bread like a small liturgy. I taught him to plant seeds in the spring and to water them every morning with careful, solemn hands. We read aloud every night until he fell asleep, curled like a comma across my thigh. People sometimes asked me if I felt like a different person now. I would laugh, a short sound behind my teeth, and say yes and no. I was the same woman who had once loved and lost, but also someone who had been given a second act, one that involved changing diapers and untying shoelaces and learning the words to kids' songs I'd never thought I'd hum.
The work was exhausting and joyous and kept me alive in a way that nothing else had since Lewis's death. I still think about the lake, the way the leather made that final sound, the blue blanket, the zipper opening. That memory is a chord I return to. It is a pivot on which the story swings. I opened it, and my life split into before and after. In the after, there was battle and there was bureaucracy, a sting operation that left me hurt, and a courtroom that left me weary. In the after, there were also diapers and first steps, and the smell of a child asleep against your chest. Both things were true. Years later, Hector is stepping into school with a backpack too big for his shoulders and a freedom in his eyes that makes me both proud and sometimes frightfully aware of the shortness of time. He asks about his father in simple, unhurried ways. I tell him stories that are tender and honest. He knows his history, the bad choices that hurt people, the people who made amends in the only ways they could, the officers who kept a promise. Sometimes I catch myself looking at his hands and seeing Lewis's hands in them, how they hold a pencil, how they stubbornly insist on using a fork like a grown-up. There are moments when grief and gratitude coil together like twin vines. I say his name aloud in quiet rooms and feel the old ache ease. I wonder what Lewis would make of this life we now have. I like to think he would laugh and complain about the state of Hector's hair, and then he'd sit with us and drink tea and hold a toddler on his knee as if the years that separate us were just a small inconvenience. I don't pretend the story is wrapped in neatness. Cynthia's conviction did not erase what she had done. The memory of the lake does not become anything other than what it is, a hard hinge in my life. But I have learned that love sometimes looks like stubborn daily care. It looks like going to the store again and bringing home carrots shaped like small moons because Hector likes them. It looks like standing in court and speaking for a child who could not speak for himself. It looks like holding a child in winter when the world is cold and making him hot chocolate until his cheeks flush. If you ask me now whether I regret that afternoon, whether I wish I had been somewhere else, the answer is always complicated. I would gladly undo the pain that put Hector in that suitcase. I would stop the greed and the choices that led to tampering and betrayal. But if the question is whether I would undo the fact that I opened the zipper and found him, no, I would not. The act of opening is a rupture in the best way. It tore two timelines together and forced a choice, to let a life drift under the reeds, or to make a fierce, messy claim for it. The house smells like bread most mornings now, and sometimes Hector will sit at the table and doodle rocket ships on the back of an envelope.
He has a laugh that is sudden and full, and an insistence on hugging like he has read a book on how to show gratitude. He calls me Nana, and sometimes Mom when he is sleepy, and I have learned to accept both names as small accommodations the world has offered us. I keep Lewis's photograph on the mantel where I can catch light in the afternoons, and sometimes I talk to him as if he might be listening. I tell him about Hector's first tooth, about the time Hector decided to wear Daddy's old boots to the grocery store, and about the way the willow tree finally lost an entire limb in a storm, and how we laughed and cried when it did. It's a strange family of ghosts and bread and laughter, and it's mine. In the end, the lake is still there. Sometimes I go down to the bank in the fall when the air has that thin ache, and I stand and remember the sound the suitcase made. The memory is sharp, and it is a warning. I tell myself stories about what I'd do differently and what I would do the same. Then I go home, and I set a plate of cookies on the counter for a boy who has more life ahead of him than any of us might have imagined. I opened it, and my life changed forever. That one action, zipping and finding, will always be the hinge I return to, the anchor in a story that could have gone in many darker directions if not for the small, stubborn fact of my running toward the water when any sensible person my age would have remained safely on the porch. If this story moved you, leave a comment and subscribe to follow Hector's journey.